White House echoes President Xi's words of progress from these latest round of trade talks. Let's get more insight with trade expert Dan Ikenson. He's the director of the Herbert Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute here in Washington. What are you reading into this latest round of talks in Beijing?
Looks like there's progress that has been signaled from both sides, a statement from the White House, a statement from the Chinese side. I think both sides want to have a deal, make a deal. They're talking about structural issues, the so-called forced technology transfer issues, intellectual property, theft, related to the Made in China 2025 issue, state-owned enterprises and the role that they play in the Chinese economy. But there's also interest in a transactional outcome to see the Chinese perhaps purchase more U.S. Commodities to help reduce the U.S. trade deficit. To me, that's not a really important issue. It's the structural matters that are the big concerns. And I think that U.S. policymakers from the Republican and the Democratic Party are sort of on board. There's broad bipartisan support for pushing China to do something about problems that have been documented for a long time.
We saw this meeting with the U.S. delegation with President Xi, and President Xi saying important progress in the current round of talks. These talks are moving back to Washington next week. Is that hopeful? What does that signal? The conversation is still continuing.
It is still continuing. Originally, the date is March 1st. In fact, it has not yet been changed. On March 1st, tariffs on about $200 billion worth of imports from China are slated to go from 10% to 25% unless a deal is reached. President Trump this week signaled that he might be willing to extend up to 60 days the negotiations. That's a very strong possibility. I mean, it seems to me a lot of the issues that are being negotiated have been problems that have been sort of metastasizing and festering for a while. So getting those issues resolved in the short time frame that we have seems kind of difficult. So I think an agreement, if it's to be reached, will be sort of an iterative agreement, one where a lot of tariffs will be lifted, but some will stay in place as leverage to sort of compel Beijing to follow through on the commitments that it's going to make. And these commitments really do need to happen. I think the relationship has entered a new sphere, and we need to find ways to continue to cooperate. Right now, I see a lot of U.S. groups that are looking at the U.S.-China relationship as something we need to condense, to truncate, and are looking for ways to remain protectionist, seeing China as a strategic competitor that is going to necessitate the United States treat China differently. Both countries have benefited massively from the bilateral trade relationship. The global economy has benefited, and that is in jeopardy unless we come up with a workable deal.
Someone told me recently that they liken this to a marriage, and they need to work together, work things out. You mentioned this possibility of a 60-day extension. What are you looking for if it gets to that point, in terms of what are you looking for to happen next week in Washington?
I think we're about ready to see the Chinese government make some commitments to agree to follow through on commitments it made when it joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. We need to get rid of joint venture requirements. The Chinese need to do a better job of opening up their services markets to U.S. exports, to allow U.S. banks to participate in the electronic payment market, to reduce agricultural subsidies, and to do a better job of reporting on them. These are things that can be done right away, and that would be a show of goodwill. And then from there, I think we would see maybe a tight timetable to get rid of the forced technology transfer requirements, pass a law that will preclude companies from being forced to share their technology, and then see benchmarks along the way, and maybe an agreement that will ultimately be put into place over the course of a year or 2 years. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and we need to build up goodwill between ourselves again. The relationship has suffered a little bit over the past year, and we need to show that we can make amends.
Dan Ikenson, thank you so much for your insight. We'll have to see what happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.